Religion played a very important role in the lives of people during the Middle Ages. While not everyone was a sincere believer, the power of the Roman Catholic Church over people's lives far exceeded that of any worldly king. Nearly every village had a small church whose priest was just as poor as the members of his flock. The priest said daily masses and performed the holy sacraments, which marked the passing of each stage of life. The church strictly regulated people's behavior in medieval times. Rich and poor alike were taught the consequences of their deeds. The vivid artwork of the churches offered glimpses into the unbearable suffering of hell and the unimaginable bliss of heaven. The Middle Ages was a time of magic and mystery, but most people were illiterate. The priest was often the only person in the village who could read and write. The church was the only institution of the age which supported education. The two oldest English universities, Cambridge and Oxford, were both founded by the church over 8 centuries ago. In the Middle Ages, every family was expected to donate 10% of their income to the church. These tithes, as they were called, were collected from the villagers at harvest time, when 1/10 of their crops were taken to church-owned tithe barns, like this one, before being sold. As a result of this practice, the church became very wealthy. Enormous, ornate churches called cathedrals were built in most major towns to serve as centers of church administration. One town competed with another to see which could create the most lavish building. These magnificent structures required the labor of hundreds of men and many centuries to complete. Cathedrals were the homes of high-ranking priests of the church, called bishops. These men controlled the church's wealth and oversaw the activities of hundreds of parish priests. Bishops were social equals to noblemen, and like them, lived in splendid palaces. Although there were many good bishops, some were corrupted by the wealth they controlled. Bishops sometimes became objects of scorn to the impoverished villagers, who saw their hard-earned tithes wasted on decorations instead of being used to save souls. The Protestant Reformation, which began in Europe near the end of the 15th century, started as a reaction to the worldliness of the church. Throughout the Middle Ages, the church had become increasingly involved in struggles for power with the nobility. As a result, in the 1530s, England's King Henry VIII decreed himself leader of the Church of England and ordered all the monasteries in his realm to be closed forever. Their treasures became the property of the king, and their leaden roofs were sold for scrap. This monastery, called Tintern Abbey, lies only 5 miles up the Wye River from Chepstow Castle. The foundation stones of this abbey were laid down only 65 years after the Norman conquest. The money for this enormous project was provided by the Lord of Chepstow Castle himself. Such extravagance was not unusual in the Middle Ages, for these acts of piety were thought to spiritually benefit the donors, who hoped that gifts to the church might help clear their ways on the path to heaven. While cathedrals were town-based administrative centers of the church, monasteries were rural centers of intense religious practice, where communities of either monks or nuns lived in isolation, cut off from all worldly influences. On this spot, for over 500 years, untold numbers of men spent their entire adult lives in quiet seclusion, following strict rules designed to bring them closer to God. Like Chepstow Castle, Tintern Abbey depended on the produce of its lands for most of its income. And, although the monks performed some of the labor in the fields, most was carried out by the lay brothers, poor, illiterate men who arrived in surprising numbers at the monastery gates, seeking food and shelter. The fully trained monks, called choir monks, shared the monastery with the lay brothers, but occupied separate areas for worship, sleeping, and eating. Most of Tintern Abbey lies in total ruin, but a nearby cathedral, which was once a monastery, still retains important structures lost at Tintern. All monasteries had cloisters, which are covered walkways surrounding a central garden that connect most of the monastery buildings. Centuries ago, they were the site of a lot of daily activity. Here monks read the scriptures as they walked along, studied in compartments along the outer wall, listened to the abbot teach, and washed their hands in the lavatorium before eating their 2 simple daily meals. Near the lavatorium were dining halls, dormitories, and the warming house, which was the only place, other than the kitchen and hospital, where a fire was allowed to burn. Here the monks could restore the circulation to their bodies after hours in the freezing church. Choir monks offered their entire lives as a sacrifice to God. Their day began at 2 a.m., when they formed a candle-lit procession, entering the church by special stairs leading from their dormitories. By the time the first rays of light passed through the stained glass windows, many hours of the day had already been spent in darkness. Throughout the day, hours of worship alternated with periods of study, until finally, after sunset, the last prayers were said and the monks were freed to return to their beds to sleep.